Greetings, students. I hope you're doing well here in week 13. I'm doing okay. I'm a little stuffed up. Hopefully that won't affect this video too much. So, we're supposed to discuss George Berkeley this week, and then David Hume next week, then Thanksgiving break, then David Hume again, and then final exams, right? So that's right around the corner. And by the way, British people assure me that it's Berkeley. You know, it looks like Berkeley, as in UC Berkeley, in the city in California named Berkeley. But he was British, so we have to allow that the British are correct when they say Berkeley. Just to give you the time frame, roughly, right? Berkeley's dates are 1685 to 1753, so that makes him a little younger than Leibniz. They're a bit close, but Berkeley comes later, and we're discussing him a bit later, right? And so, of course, Berkeley is familiar with the works of Descartes and Locke, and in fact is responding to their work. Leibniz, on the other hand, he doesn't have anything to say about, which is odd, right? Because Leibniz and Berkeley are both idealists, right? So we're looking at the three dialogues between Hylas and Philonous. Now, again, there's an issue of pronunciation there. Berkeley made those names up, so I'm just going to pronounce them the way that I think is best. Hylas comes from the Greek hule, but if you see a Y in English, you're not going to say oo in response. So I posit rather than assume that Hylas is the correct pronunciation. You could probably make Philonous sound more natural by saying Philonous or something like that. I've heard people say such things. But the point of using the name Philonous is that philo means love and nous means mind. Philonous is a lover of the mind. We might as well say it in such a way that you can hear that association, right? So we were supposed to read Dialogue 1 from the three dialogues. I also asked you to read sections 1 through 3 at least of part 1 of Berkeley's Treatise concerning the principles of human knowledge. And those are his idealist works, right? So again, there's this strong connection between Berkeley and Leibniz, but I don't have much reason to think that Berkeley read Leibniz. He's not responding directly to Leibniz. He's an idealist, but he comes at idealism through a different route. He doesn't adhere to idealism for the same reasons that Leibniz does. Leibniz seems to be focused on problems of interaction, right? There's mind-body interaction. Leibniz tries to fix that, I would say, by embracing idealism. Then he tries to deal with interaction among bodies that aren't material by coming up with pre-established harmony. So Leibniz is focused on problems of interaction. Berkeley takes empiricism as a starting point, right? So we only know things through the senses. That's his starting point, which is different from Leibniz's starting point. Leibniz is obviously a rationalist. He gives various rationalist arguments, right? He believes that we can know things based on pure reason without empirical data. The principle of sufficient reason in Leibniz all by itself indicates that whatever we know has to rationally make sense. There can't be inexplicable data, right? We can't have inexplicable empirical data. We'll just have to throw it out, right? Because there's always a sufficient reason to account for any fact. That is not the empiricist view at all, right? The empiricist view is, here are the facts, right? Maybe we can make sense of them, maybe we can't, but these are the facts that come to us through the senses. That's what we know for sure. And then what we can do with the facts, whether we can create a coherent theory of the facts, that's a different matter. Now, of course, Berkeley believes in the principle of non-contradiction, which is not explicitly, or certainly exclusively, maybe that's what I meant to say, a rationalist principle, right? Empiricists generally hold the principle of non-contradiction to be true, and they employ it. And you see Berkeley trying to show in various ways that holding materialist views leads to contradiction. So that's worth noting. The principle of sufficient reason is out. The principle of non-contradiction stays in. As I've said, Berkeley is not responding to Leibniz. He doesn't show awareness of Leibniz. I don't know why that is. He is responding to Descartes' dualism, Locke's sort of dualism. We said before, Locke doesn't want to commit to any metaphysical view about the mind-body distinction, or any metaphysical view that directly bears on the mind-body distinction. But he doesn't deny that dualism is true. He seems to separate minds and bodies in practice. I think we saw that in what we read from the essay. So Berkeley wants to reject dualism. He thinks just allowing that material bodies exist, or admitting that they exist, it doesn't really make sense. We don't need material bodies. We shouldn't posit their existence. We can get by without them. They're metaphysically extravagant. That's Berkeley's view. He's certainly arguing against Thomas Hobbes, whom we haven't read, right? But Hobbes, author of the Leviathan. Hobbes is a materialist, right? So Berkeley's definitely arguing against him and the dualists, right? And now we're starting to get into the text, into the first dialogue. So let's say that the way the dialogue opens, I do have to keep especially hydrated today. The way the dialogue opens is Hylas is worried about metaphysical extravagance and skepticism. It's not a well-written dialogue, okay? Let's be honest. Plato wrote gorgeous dialogues with beautiful characters in them, fascinating characters. David Hume wrote an excellent dialogue on religion with really rich characterization. That is not what we get here. What we get here is very flat characters. They have philosophical views, but we don't really know much else about them. They're both pious, right? So you can hardly tell them apart, except Hylas comes into this as a materialist, and Philonous comes into this as an idealist, and he wants to convince Hylas that materialism is bad and wrong, right? So Hylas is working in his garden. That's as much of a characterization as we're going to get. Philonous happens upon him, right? And like I said, Hylas is concerned about metaphysical extravagance. He brings it up right away. Right? There's no stage setting, or not much. And then Philonous agrees. Yeah, those philosophers, they go nuts. They're too skeptical, and their views are too wild, too out of whack, right? So this is important philosophical stage setting. The two agree that common sense is good, and that philosophers should try to stick to common sense, right? They might have to reject it, they might be forced, but in general, philosophers should try to stick to common sense. They shouldn't develop theories and concepts that stray very far from common sense. Another way to put that would be philosophers should account for the phenomena, right? They shouldn't revise the phenomena. This is an ongoing issue in philosophy. To what extent should we revise our view of the world, and to what extent should we account for the way the world appears to us? These two are agreeing we should focus on accounting for the way the world actually appears, and not try to radically revise how we view the world. That is the correct way to do philosophy. Hylas and Philonous agree on that, and then what's interesting is, at first, Hylas, of course, thinks materialism is sort of obvious, and you wouldn't want to throw that out. You'd want to hold on to materialism to preserve the appearances, right? It would be radical, and it would be extravagant to throw out materialism. And then Philonous is turning that conventional view. Certainly in the time Berkeley is writing, that's conventional, right? Hylas's views are conventional. Of course, there are material bodies, and they account for our ideas of them, right? That's conventional. Philonous is agreeing that we shouldn't stray far from common sense. We shouldn't engage in metaphysical extravagance. But he thinks that pushes in a different direction from what it seems to. He thinks that if we really adhere to common sense, we're actually going to reject materialism. We're going to reject the existence of material bodies. Okay, so hopefully by the end of this lecture, it'll be clear why that's so. Why is it part of common sense to reject materialism and instead be idealists, which doesn't sound like common sense. Most people aren't going to say they're idealists. But that's the view. Berkeley and Philonous both think, that you can preserve more of common sense, that you can do a better job preserving the appearances. I would even say this isn't a phrase that Berkeley uses. You can preserve more of naive realism, just the ordinary everyday idea that when I look around I see real things. I mean, that's where Berkeley is coming from. Very common sense notion. You look around the room, you go outside, you look around, you look at the trees. What you're seeing are real things. That's what Berkeley's trying to preserve. He, whatever his reputation might be, whatever you might think of when you hear the word idealism, that's what Berkeley's trying to preserve. Just naive, everyday, mundane realism. You look around, you see real things. That's what Philonous wants to protect, and he thinks that you do that by rejecting the existence of material bodies. Okay, and just to anchor you a bit now, we'll start getting more into the details of the text. On page 670, in the middle of the second column, the column on the right, Philonous and Hylas explicitly agree to endorse whatever opinion is most agreeable to common sense and most remote from skepticism. So just so you can look it up for yourself, in that part of the text, 670, they agree we'll go toward common sense, we'll go away from skepticism, right? And if you're looking online, we're just at the very beginning of the dialogue at this point. Okay, pages 670 to 671. There's an interesting discussion about what skepticism is, right? So they're moving away from skepticism, so they need to know what it is. They don't define common sense, by the way. That's a bit of a lacuna there. But they do try to define skepticism, and they roughly say a skeptic is someone who denies reality, and that fits in with what we were just saying about naive realism. And again, Philonous thinks rejecting material bodies will help to preserve reality. So being an idealist is actually anti-skeptical. Okay, and then there's a key point on the bottom right of page 671. We've got to figure out what real things are. We're talking about whether to accept reality or deny reality. So that raises the question of whether we should trust our senses, which raises the question of what a sensible thing is. And that's a term that Hylas and Philonous use. They talk about sensible things. So now I'll quote from page 671. Hylas says, "By sensible things I mean those only which are perceived by sense." Let me try it again. "By sensible things I mean those only which are perceived by sense, and that in truth the senses perceive nothing which they do not perceive immediately." Okay, Berkeley's going to get a lot of mileage out of that characterization of sensible things. So a sensible thing, not only is it something you get through the senses, but it's something you get immediately from the senses. That's an important point for Berkeley. We're not going to talk about what you could get immediately from the senses. That is to say, do the senses suggest other things? Is there something beyond what we can get from the senses of Is there something beyond what we can get from the surface of sensory things? Right? Is there a substance, in other words? I mean, that's what's being hinted at here. Do the things we see or hear or smell, do they suggest the existence of substances? Well, this definition is convenient for Berkeley in that, it tells you that sensible things are what can be immediately perceived, and it will be easy to show that substances aren't immediately perceived, right? Not that Berkeley doesn't go farther. I mean, he further argues that substances aren't even really suggested because we don't know what it would do for us, really, to posit material substances. We don't know that it would really explain what it purports to explain. Okay, so we know what they mean by sensible things, so moving on from there, page 672, Philonous gets Hylas to agree that, quote, sensible things, therefore, are nothing else but so many sensible qualities or combinations of sensible qualities. Right? That's in line with what we were just saying. So a sensible thing is something you immediately perceive. Well, what do you really immediately perceive? Sensible properties, right? And of course, we've read our locks, so then we have a list ready to go in our minds, right? We have the secondary qualities such as color and sound and odor and flavor, warmth and cold. Those play an important role near the beginning of the dialogue. And then you've got your primary qualities, right? Extension and motion, things along those lines, texture, the texture of a surface. Right, so again, Berkeley's going to get a lot of mileage out of this. A sensible thing is what you immediately perceive, therefore it's a bundle of sensory properties. Can sensory properties exist outside of the mind? Now that we're focusing on sensory properties, a lot of you already maybe want to say, no, they can't, right? But some of you will say, yes, sensory properties can exist outside of the mind, especially the primary ones, perhaps, right? So let's get into the arguments some more and see what Philonous wants to say about that. Shortly after these clarifications and definitions about sensible things that we were just discussing, Philonous puts forward a doctrine that is very closely and strongly associated with Berkeley, and that doctrine is to exist is to be perceived, which sounds pretty wild, sounds extravagant, but that's what Philonous is going to keep coming back to. When we talk about the existence of ordinary things, playing that common sense card, when we talk about the existence of ordinary things, those things can be perceived. So from Philonous' perspective, it's extravagant to talk about things that can't be perceived as if they're real. Our ordinary experience of reality is that reality is perceivable. We can perceive it, we do perceive it every day. So, Philonous puts forward this strong doctrine to exist is to be perceived, at least for ordinary sensible things. Now, perceivers also have to exist, right? So this doctrine doesn't cover everything, but it does cover sensible things. For sensible things to exist is to be perceived. And then, of course, Hylas rejects that, right? Hylas is going to say, of course, sensible things can exist without being perceived. All right, so Philonous basically ends up going through a list, just like we rattled off a list. Philonous and Hylas have read their John Locke because Berkeley has read his John Locke. So let's go through these properties. So we start with heat, right? So I'll tell you what happens in the text, and then I'll tell you the ideal argument at the same time. So Philonous argues that, with extreme heat, if you accidentally touch a burner on the stove, say, with extreme heat, we find that the heat and the pain of the extreme heat, they're inseparable from each other. I think sometimes that's true. I'm not sure it's always true. I'm not sure I completely agree. I think you can get a sensation of heat and then a split second later the pain shows up. But on the other hand, I will grant to Berkeley and Philonous, well, once the pain shows up, it is a hot pain. I mean, I don't know how else to put it. So I guess that's what Philonous means. There's a certain kind of pain that you get from a burn, and it feels very hot, right? And you can't separate the pain and the heat. Now, why is that important? Well, because Hylas and Philonous find it easy to agree that, well, of course, pain and pleasure don't exist outside the mind. So maybe you could have a heated argument, pun intended, about whether heat exists outside of the mind. But Hylas isn't going to try to argue that pain and pleasure don't exist. Sorry, he's not. Hylas isn't going to try to argue that pain and pleasure do exist outside of the mind, right? He's going to allow that they don't exist outside of the mind, right? He'll admit that pain and pleasure are subjective. So, if it's true that in many experiences, maybe not all of them, extreme heat and pain are inseparable. You can't really analyze the experience to take them apart, or in such a way that you could take them apart. If that's true, it would suggest that heat is also subjective. If heat is so intermingled with pain that you can't tell them apart, and pain is admitted to be subjective, then that would strongly suggest that heat itself is subjective. And then you might think of a more moderate heat, a warmth, if you will. So imagine you're sitting by the fire and you're just feeling warm, you're not too close to the fire. That can be very pleasant, especially if you've come in from the cold, right? And then the same issue arises. Well, if we can't separate the pleasantness, the pleasure from the warmth, and we allow that pleasure is subjective, then so is the warmth, right? Okay, so can we generalize from that? That's basically Philonous' strategy here, right? Is to generalize from what is stated near the beginning about warmth, right? And then that goes on for like 10 pages, just generalizing from the case of warmth. First, Philonous just goes through, again, the secondary qualities, because it's easier to show that those only exist in the mind. But then he attacks the primary qualities as well, on the basis of what's already been established with the secondary qualities. So that's the strategy. And there's a general argument here that we should just state now, right? So Berkeley doesn't state it at this point, but we should state it. So the pithy version of the argument that's being made is heat, or fill in the blank, color, later we get extension. The pithy version of the argument is that it is phenomenal. Heat is phenomenal. Color is phenomenal, extension is phenomenal. That is to say, it appears, it shows up, it's phenomenal, right? Positing a non-phenomenal body for heat to exist in doesn't help us understand why or how the heat can exist, right? So with respect to whatever phenomenal thing we're focused on, whether it's heat or color or extension, positing a material body, right, insisting a material body exists to account for the phenomenal thing is metaphysically extravagant, doesn't make sense, doesn't help. That's the strategy that keeps being used here, right? So heat's phenomenal. Heat's something that shows up for us, right? So we have it. We have an experience of it, right? So can some external body that doesn't show up, that isn't phenomenal, help to account for that? Berkeley says no. The phenomenal is the phenomenal. It's unlike anything that's not phenomenal, right? You can't posit something radically different to account for the phenomenal. You shouldn't posit something essentially non-phenomenal to account for the phenomenal. That's how Berkeley keeps arguing again and again. Okay, so moving on with respect to the text, pretty quickly, Hylas agrees that sweetness and bitterness aren't in external objects, right? Or in our terms that we're using, yes, heat and bitterness are phenomenal. We can't account for them by positing non-phenomenal things out there. That's on page 675, where Hylas admits that. And then odors are briefly discussed. Okay, odors, we admit those don't exist out there. They're not in bodies out there, right? So they're phenomenal in our terms. On pages 675 and 676, Hylas starts trying to make this distinction with regard to sounds that he thinks will prove that sounds are out there. They're not just ideas, right? So the way we can put it in contemporary terms is we can say, well, there's the experience of sound, and then there are sound waves in the air, right? Which are pretty well understood mathematically, by the way. Berkeley would know something about that. He started out studying math and then moved to philosophy. Never left math completely behind, by the way. So yeah, putting Hylas's point in contemporary terms, hey, sounds exist out there, right? Because really what a sound is a vibration, right, in the air. It's a movement of the air molecules. That would be the contemporary way of putting Hylas's point. And I think Berkeley or Philonous, they're really the same guy. I think Philonous makes a really strong point against that. And he says, look, if you tell me that real sounds are vibrations of the air, and then what we experience is a fake sound or a not real sound, maybe fake is too derogatory, but the sounds we experience aren't real, but sound waves are real. If you want to put it that way, it's absurd, because then you're saying we could see or feel real sounds, but we can't hear real sounds, right? I mean, that's what you end up saying, because you can certainly see and feel vibrations, but the whole point is, well, real sounds are out there and they're not the things you can hear in your mind. Therefore, according to what Hylas is saying, you can't, by definition, hear real sounds. But since they're vibrations, you can see and feel them. That goes against common sense, right? And Hylas and Philonous have agreed to uphold common sense and to go against metaphysical extravagances, right? So it does seem, I think this is a strong point, it does seem like the best way to uphold common sense in this context, this specific context, is to say, we can hear sounds, right? And because we can hear sounds, we have to reject the idea that real sounds are vibrations in the air. And it's not that Berkeley is anti-scientific. It's not that he wants to deny any connection between vibrations in the air and hearing sounds. That's not the point, right? He actually is pretty informed of the science of his day and talks about how if you put a bell in a vacuum and you try to ring the bell, it doesn't make a sound. He brings that up in the text, right? So he understands that there's some kind of connection, some kind of causal connection, apparently, between vibrations in the air and hearing a sound, but he's not going to allow that real sounds are in the material realm that we can't directly perceive, because that leads to skepticism. If real sounds are out there, we can't hear them. So how would we know whether they exist, right? If real sounds are out there and we can't hear sounds as a result, then we're just going to end up saying sounds don't exist. Berkeley can't accept that conclusion, right? That sounds don't exist. It doesn't make sense to him. It flies in the face of common sense. So he's going to preserve the appearances, preserve the idea that sounds are things you can hear. They're sensibles, perceptibles, right? And that's how he does it. Okay, and then on pages 676 to 679, we get to colors. The most interesting part of the discussion, I think, is that Hylas, of course, not surprisingly to me, for sure, Hylas tries to distinguish between apparent colors and real colors, right? Because we all know that colors look different under different conditions, right? Clouds normally look white, but then when the sun is setting, they could look pink or purple, right? But those are just apparent colors, Hylas says, right? So then, of course, that raises the question of, well, what is a real color? How do you know when you're looking at a real color? And this is a typical move. It's not just Hylas's move. This is what people generally want to say when they want to defend the notion of real color. Well, under the right conditions, under the right viewing conditions. So when nothing unusual is happening, so what? You're outdoors on a sunny day and the sun is high in the sky and it's not being obscured by clouds. Are those ideal conditions? Hylas doesn't say, but that's the sort of thing people usually go for. But Philonous can say and does say, well, now wait a minute. What about microscopes? Right? Don't microscopes give a better view of things, right? I mean, we admit that if you're seeing something from far away, this point goes way back. We saw it in Descartes, but of course it goes back before Descartes. If you're seeing something from far away, those aren't good conditions, right? So part of what we mean by ideal conditions is something is close enough for us to see it well. Well, wait a minute, what about microscopes, right? With a microscope, you can get really close. You can see it really well. But as we've mentioned, with respect to other authors in this course, well, coloration looks a little different under the microscope, right? If you've actually looked through a microscope, I hope you have. I've taken enough science classes to look through a few microscopes. Yeah, coloration gets weird, right? So you can do things to, make a microscopic image look like it would normally look if it were blown up to scale, right? But if you actually look through a microscope and you've had that experience, you know things look a little weird, right? Color gets a little patchy, and the color you see at a macro level isn't quite the same as what you see at the micro level, right? And so Philonous is just undermining the notion of ideal conditions here, right? If we don't want to be skeptical, what we want to do is preserve the appearances that we get of medium-sized objects on a sort of everyday basis, right? That's what we'd want to preserve if we want to promote common sense and not be skeptical. But, this notion of ideal conditions, which is supposed to help with that, it falls apart, right? Because, yeah, it's true. Part of what makes ideal conditions ideal is closeness, proximity to the object, and microscopes rely on that, but they don't show us exactly the same thing as we see at the macro level. Therefore, if we want to rely on ideal conditions, it actually ends up undermining the macro world, right? The world of medium-sized objects. Okay. So trying to defend colors as existing out there doesn't work, not surprisingly, and it kind of leads to contradictions, right? Okay, and then they move on to primary qualities. Hylas makes the distinction that we were probably expecting between primary qualities and secondary qualities on page 679, right? So Hylas basically points out, okay, well now we've shown all the secondary qualities don't exist outside the mind, but that's okay. We've got the primary qualities left, and Hylas, ever the optimist, I guess, expresses confidence that, we can show that primary qualities exist out there, right? And Philonous, of course, is going to knock it down. No, primary qualities don't exist out there. Don't be silly. So they first discuss extension, and it's an interesting line of argument. Philonous argues basically that extension is relative, right? What does he mean by that? Well, it's related to the point that was just made about microscopes, actually. What scale is the correct scale? You can only make a definite determination about how long or wide or high something is by comparing it to some other body, right? We know this. How do you measure something usually in everyday life? You get a tape measure or you get a ruler, right? So you put one body up against another body and you say, oh, this is, 10 inches wide, or you say that guy is 6 feet tall, right? That sort of thing. You compare one body to another body. But the basis of comparison changes, right? So there are microscopic creatures, there are mites. I believe that's what Philonous mentions. So they have a sense of the scale of things based on their body. And I have a scale of things. I have a scale of things in mind, a scale against which I measure the extension of things. To elaborate that a bit more, I have a scale that's based on my body, right? And then somewhere out there in the universe, there are enormous creatures. Well, I mean, there are whales on Earth, but out there somewhere, even bigger creatures, right? And their scale is different, right? So extension isn't as definite as it seems to be. It's relative, right? It's relative to the perceiver, which shows it's subjective and not objective. So it doesn't exist in any mind-independent things. Okay, so that might not be convincing on its own, although I think it's a pretty good argument. But on page 680, we get the master argument. What do I mean by the master argument? Well, this is, pardon me, I'm itchy. Got an itchy face. The master argument is something that Berkeley scholars talk about. So if you look at section 3 of part 1 of the treatise, that is generally considered to be the master argument. Now, here on page 680 of the 3 dialogues, we get a differently worded version of the master argument, but it's basically the same argument. Okay? So page 680, the argument goes like this. Any sensible thing, which is what we've been talking about all along, things out there are sensible things, presumably. Any sensible thing or sensible property is an idea. Okay, that's just a term, right? But what we relate to, I mean, this, Locke used the word in this way, Descartes used the word in this way. Anything we relate to mentally that we have a mental intention toward, we can call an idea. That makes sense. So a sensible thing or a sensible property is an idea, and we just can't conceive of any idea existing outside the mind. It doesn't matter whether it's extension or color or sound or odor. When we try to conceive of the idea existing outside of the mind, we can't do it. Conversely, we can't conceive of any non-sensible thing appearing to us in our mind, because how would it appear? It would appear through its sensory properties. So non-sensible things are sort of a negative, like we don't know what they are because they don't show up for us. Sensible things, we can't imagine them not showing up. We can't imagine sensible things as nonsensible, in other words. And then those nonsensible things, we could say the words, but they're sort of a blank to us. We don't know what that means exactly. And then, furthermore, this isn't really part of the master argument, but it's immediately tacked on in this dialogue. We don't understand how positing non-sensible things, such as material substances, would help account for or explain the sensible properties or sensory things, right? So you could say, oh, there are material things out there, and that's why we have ideas in our consciousness. Well, what do these two have in common? All we know about the non-sensible things is that they're non-sensible. That's what I mean by saying it's a negative. Well, what is it? What is this thing out there? It's non-sensible. Well, that's a negative characterization, right? And you can say it's extended, but Berkeley just argued that what we think of as extension is a sensible thing, right? And he furthermore argued that there's a scale, right, that's built into extension. We don't have any sense of extension or extendedness without a scale, and the scale is keyed to the body of the perceiver. And if we're talking about scaleless, perceiverless, non-centered extension, like without any sense of how big or how small something is, we're not, it has no meaning. We're not talking about anything. So a different way of putting what Berkeley has been saying all along is things have meaning through their phenomenal appearance. And when we try to talk about things that don't have a phenomenal appearance, it's meaningless. It doesn't mean anything, right? So that's something to think about. Is all meaning grounded in phenomenal experience or not? If all meaning is grounded in phenomenal experience, and it might be, Berkeley's right. I would say. I would put it in the form of a conditional, as I just did. If it's true that meaning comes from phenomenal experience, then yeah, we should reject material substances existing out there that aren't phenomenal. And by the way, that's not Kant's view. Right? Just to bring Kant into it again, since we're kind of headed, it's like a telos for us. We're headed toward Kant. Kant believes that our understanding helps to shape our experience. So meaning goes beyond phenomenality. And that's why Kant can say, or believes he's entitled to say, there are things in themselves that we don't phenomenally experience, right? Our understanding can conceive of them because our understanding shapes the data, right? So we're not blank slates. That's not Kant's view. That's Locke's view, and it's Berkeley's view. And I do think this is the same thing as what I already said, but in different words. I do think if you agree that we're blank slates, then Berkeley is pretty much right, although the implications of that are more skeptical than Berkeley realizes. Berkeley doesn't take himself to be a skeptic. But once you reject things out there and say they don't exist, sensible things are mental, they depend on the mind, that puts you in a really skeptical spot. Berkeley sort of knows that because, he ends up saying, well, look, existence is to be perceived, right? We already mentioned that. So then he has to posit God's continuous perception of everything, right? If existence is to be perceived, then do things go out of existence when you quit perceiving them? Well, no, because, says Berkeley, God continually perceives everything, so don't worry about it, right? But David Hume just takes things a bit farther, right? And he's an empiricist, and he lets empiricism play itself out till you get to the most skeptical conclusions. We don't know if there's a God, and maybe things don't exist when you don't perceive them. And as a matter of fact, as we've already said with respect to David Hume, you never see the same object twice anyway. The notion of a stable object over time with different sensory properties over time is a fiction, right? So that seems to be just taking Berkeley's ball and running with it, right? You're right, Berkeley. Things don't exist out there. There's just, they're only experiential objects. Those are the only kind that exist. Those are the only kind we can talk about. But experiential objects don't have continuity of existence. Therefore, everything's changing all the time, right? Now you end up with David Hume. But that's not Berkeley. Berkeley, right? To go back to Berkeley, he's making some excellent points here, and the tendency of them is to show us that things don't exist out there, and Berkeley thinks that's okay. They exist in us, right, in conscious minds, and then there's this super conscious mind that's always perceiving everything, so it's fine. Don't worry about it. Okay, and not surprisingly, motion turns out to be relative, right? I mean, if extension is, it makes sense that motion is. How do you grasp motion? It's the same thing. One body has to move relative to another body. So the same issue arises. It's relative, so okay, it's easy to say no motion out there without human minds, right? If we're going to accept the relativity argument, it works for motion as well as it does for extension. And then solidity, Philonous argues that it's relative as well, which makes sense. What's solid for an ant isn't the same as what's solid for me. I might be able to go right through something that an ant can't get through. And then, of course, you think of Locke's discussion of solidity, which Berkeley has read. Our idea of solidity depends very much on resistance, right, which we wouldn't think of as being out there on its own, right? It's something we experience. We experience resistance. We have to try to push something and find that we can't, and then we have an experience of resistance. So I think it's easier to argue that solidity is phenomenal than it is to argue that motion is phenomenal. There is an interesting point on page 682 at which Du Châtelet and Berkeley converge. Right? In general, they're very different because Du Châtelet is a Leibnizian and Leibniz is a rationalist. But you might recall Du Châtelet argued that extension is non-real because it's just an abstraction. I mean, it was more complicated than that, but that was the gist of it. And Berkeley makes the same argument here, which I still don't think shows he's read any Leibniz. He doesn't mention Leibniz's name. But it does show idealists have a certain repertoire of arguments that they use, whether they're rationalists or empiricists, right? So Berkeley thinks extension is an abstraction. It's what you get when you think of extended bodies and you start subtracting some of their phenomenal properties, right? But there's no reason to think abstractions exist, right? They're things that we can imagine as a result of our mental processes, but we don't experience them through the senses. We don't passively receive them, right? So why think such an abstract thing as extension exists? Okay, I don't necessarily need to cover the rest of the dialogue here. So what do we want to end with? On pages 684, the end of 684 going into 685, there's a somewhat detailed discussion of material substance, or a material substratum, as it's called. So Hylas at first tries to argue that we need a material substratum to hold the sensible properties together, right? Philonous first gets him to admit that his notion of the material substratum is merely relative, right? That is to say, it relates to what we perceive, but it is not itself something we perceive. So that's already a big concession. But then Philonous keeps pushing on this notion of a material substratum, and he wants to know, how does the material substratum relate to sensible things or sensible properties? And Hylas isn't really able to answer that question. And the reason is we can't directly perceive a material substratum. So this goes back to Berkeley's point that this is meaningless talk. When we talk about things that can't be perceived, it's meaningless. We're not able to say anything definite about them, right? The material substratum supports sensible properties. Well, how? We've already admitted extension isn't a material property. It's not non-mental, in other words. It's subjective, right? When we talk about extension, we're talking about our experiences of extension. So that's mental, that's subjective, right? So then if we talk about a substratum being under things or supporting things, that's a spatial metaphor. Right? We're invoking extension, but it's illicit at this point. We're not allowed to invoke extension because things out there aren't extended, is the best way to put it. We could say, well, they're not extended in the way that things that show up for us are extended, but then that would mean whatever extension is out there, we have no intuitive sense of it, and it's meaningless, right? So Hylas initially says he's conceding the point that this notion of a material substratum is relative, but eventually admits, oh, it's a completely negative idea. That is to say, it has no positive content. We don't know what it means. We don't know what we're talking about when we say material substratum. And then two more things, then we're done. Page 686, Philonous points out that we basically can't conceive of any sensible thing existing outside of the mind. That is to say, it's a bit of a trick, but there's something to it. I'll leave you to think about it. You try to think of a non-perceived thing, something we don't perceive, something we don't think of. Try to think of it, right? Out there in the world with no perceiver and no conceiver. Try to think of it. Okay, well now you're related to it, right? So you try to think of this non-subjective thing, and you can only think of it with your own subjectivity, right? That would be another way to put the same point. And a lot of people don't give this argument much credit. I think it goes back to the point about meaning. Berkeley's not really given enough credit for this. He's one of the things he's saying, at least, is it doesn't mean anything when you talk about things that are non-experiential. You don't know what you're talking. Everything we know is based on experience. You try to talk about something outside experience, it's not meaningful. It's not grounded in our reality. Our reality is an experiential reality, right? So a lot of people don't give this argument any credit, you know. Oh, you try to conceive of something out there that nobody ever conceived of, and now you're conceiving of it. Oh, that's silly. What a silly argument. Some people just dismiss it. I think it's strong. I don't know that it's insurmountable. I think it's a strong argument because what it's really getting at is our notions of things come to us from experience. Our meaning, the meaningfulness of our reality comes from experience. So how is anything meaningful? How are we using words in a meaningful way when we're trying to talk about the outside of experience? I'm not sure that's meaningful. I think there's something to it. And then we kind of started with a point about immediacy, right? Sensible things are immediately sensible, right? When we talk about sensible things, they show up immediately for the senses. Hylas tries to push this point now, late in the game, that well, we can perceive some things that we don't immediately perceive. So he brings up Julius Caesar. You're looking at a statue of Julius Caesar, right? And I don't know, the statue creates a problem for me. We've got a representation of a representation, perhaps. Let's just imagine we're looking at Julius Caesar. I think that makes the example better. We just went back in time, and there's Julius Caesar, right? So can you immediately perceive Julius Caesar or not? Philonous says no, right? I mean, here's Dr. Ogle. Can you immediately perceive Dr. Ogle? I mean, the same problem. I'm on a screen. But what if you came to my office hours in person and you kind of went, well, there's Dr. Ogle. Can you immediately perceive me or not? Philonous says no. You can't. You get a time machine, you go back in time, you look at Julius Caesar, you can't immediately perceive Julius Caesar. You can't immediately perceive Jeff Ogle. Why not? Well, what's really going on is there's a bundle of sensory properties. This fleshiness here, this stuff. Got some brown hair left and some gray, and certain combination of colorations and vocal tone. I like these hand gestures, There's a bunch of different sensory stuff all bundled together, and it's associated with the sound, Jeff Ogle, and the sound, Dr. Ogle. You've heard these sounds before, and you associate them with these sensory things, this sensory stuff, this bundle, right? So what you immediately perceive is just the sensory properties, but you've bundled them together because you've seen them together before. So memory comes up here, right? We think maybe we could immediately see Dr. Jeff Ogle, but what we're getting is a bundle of properties that we've seen before, and we've learned to associate the name Jeff Ogle with that bundle. And also we have expectations of other sensory properties based on having experienced the same or a similar bundle in the past, right? So there's a whole theory of knowledge here, right? How do you know an object? Not just a specific sensory property, but how do you know an object? Well, it's a matter of memory and association or bundling. Certain sensory properties get bundled together, they get associated with each other, right? So we are able to refer to them by the same name and then keep track of them in our memory. And that's how we know objects rather than just specific sensory properties. Okay, that was fun, I think. I hope you had some fun. Berkeley's interesting. He's deeper than he gets credit for. I mean, if you take a modern philosophy class, everybody studies Berkeley. He's still there in the mix. People read Berkeley, but I think a lot of people just dismiss him. That's stupid. Well, no, it's not, right? There's an issue of what we can talk about here and what we can't talk about and what's meaningful and what's meaningless. And it's very deep, I think. How can we ever talk about anything? Isn't it based on our experience? If not, why not? Okay, so enjoy your thoughts about Berkeley. Enjoy spinning around in the subjective abyss that I helped to open up for you. So long.